Thank you very much for the rather generous introduction, and thank you all for still being here at this time of day. I certainly appreciate it, as of course many of the previous speakers have mentioned. I'll start by saying that I'm a medicinal chemist by training. In fact, my training was carried out, formative years in particular, in the company that gives its name to the building that you're all sitting in now. So I'm not really, I can no longer really be called an up-and-coming medicinal chemist as per the discussion this morning. And I probably take a pretty liberal view on the definition of a drug-like molecule, and you'll probably get that from some of the structures I'll show you in some of the slides coming up. The company I work for is based in China, as I'm sure many of you realise, and we collaborate and support many of the groups represented in this room today. A lot of that work is synthetic medicinal chemistry, but it feeds through into in vitro, ADME, in vivo DMPK across multiple species, and toxicology. But really, I'm not going to talk about much of that at all today. What I'm going to talk about today is more focused on the opportunity in China, the possibilities of collaborations in China, and perhaps the role that companies like WuXi can play in facilitating those kind of collaborations. And towards the end, I'll give a few examples of the kind of collaborations that we've taken part in particular with multinational, but also with China-based companies. And typically the model is multinational companies using a company like WuXi to get into China, and Chinese companies using a company like WuXi to create a worldwide platform for their facilities and products. But I felt I had to start with a slide on neglected diseases, and the plots you see on this slide are actually quite old data, as some of you may recognise. It's actually about 10 years old in terms of the number of co-endemic diseases and types of NTD represented in China. But I include this mainly to make the point that although we very often think of China as being, a very affluent society, we always hear about rapid growth in the economy and the like. China is essentially a rural country. The vast majority of the people, and of course there are very, very large numbers of people, live in rural economies, rural regions, where the kind of diseases we've been talking about today are still present, still need dealing with, and really ought to be getting more attention than they do. And the lower right panel here lists some of the reasons for these diseases being still so problematic in China. But in terms of wider healthcare issues in China, you may realise that total healthcare spending in China is growing at a very, very rapid pace, roughly doubling in the 5-year period mentioned here. And the spend on pharmaceuticals has accelerated to the point where China is already the 3rd largest and will soon become the 2nd largest market worldwide for pharmaceuticals. Some of that is driven by increasing rates of health insurance, and the government is helping significantly with that. But nevertheless, the per capita spend on disease remains woefully low. And just to take the example of diabetes, and to put it in perspective, China has about 4 times as many diabetes patients as the US, yet the spend per patient is a couple of $100 per person per year compared to about $5,000 in the US. China, like much of Europe, also has a growing issue with an aging population, but of course the issue in China is even more pronounced, partly because of the numbers and partly because of the one-child policy. So currently, in 2010, about 8% of the population were over 65, and I quote the comparator number here for the UK as well. By 2050, probably feels like a long time away, but in practice, it's not that far. There will be something like 330 million aged people in China. So China will have overtaken the UK in the proportion of people over 65, and of course that has massive implications for healthcare costs. Many of you will know that funding in China is driven by a 5-year plan, and the last 5-year plan provided about $1 billion. Don't worry too much about the size of these numbers. They are massive numbers, I recognise, but they're proportional numbers as well. About $1 billion in the last 5-year plan to create national new drug development programs and centres. So that the majority of that money went into new institutes and expanding existing institutes. And a lot of the focus is outward-facing. It's on creating collaborative projects worldwide. The current 5-year plan provides $15 billion into 7 emerging industries, one of which is life sciences. And these industries currently provide about 5% to GDP, but they're funded to grow that to about 15% over the relatively short period of time. And again, a lot of this money is going into substantial new research institutes, and I mentioned one here that I have collaborations with personally in Tianjin, a $200 million investment into an institute that opened in 2009, very outward-facing, very comprehensive drug discovery capabilities, very, very keen to participate on a worldwide market with academic collaborations, pharmaceutical collaborations. Most recently, you may have seen a press release indicating a major collaboration with Genzyme for this institute. To put that into perspective, China has about 5,000 domestic pharma companies and about 1,000 biotech, but really a lot of the manpower is about distribution. That's driven partly by the fact that many of the pharma and biotech companies are very small industries, and of course it's a massive country to distribute goods around. So about 90% of these companies are SMEs in our language, and many of them are only involved in manufacturing and distribution. But nevertheless, the largest companies are billion-dollar companies, and there are a handful of them, and they're spending a lot of money now in acquiring assets to distribute in China and entering into joint ventures with Western companies and even acquiring Western companies. Investment into discovery work obviously translates. One of the metrics we use is patent filings, and patent filings by Chinese companies and academics now rank China about 3rd behind the US and Japan. And interestingly, about half of that work is in biologics, and you'll see a lot of comments on biologics-based drug discovery in China, and some of the collaborations I will talk about in a few slides' time pick that point up. But I can't ignore the fact that there are many long-established drug discovery institutes in China, and I think SIM, the Shanghai Institute of Materia Medica, was mentioned this morning, and of course there's a similar institute in Beijing, and they're all actively seeking and are funded to support academic and collaborations worldwide. So I would certainly encourage you to reach out. One of the mechanisms, of course, by which you can do that is through organizations like our own organization. Another observation, of course, is that the majority of multinational corporations are now represented with research operations in China, and that's translated to very, very significant sales, billion-dollar sales for a number of MNCs operating in China now. And it's also translated to high-value acquisitions of specialty companies, including biologics companies, as well as distribution networks. Part of that growth is the growth of contract research organizations, and China currently traps about 10% of the global outsourced drug discovery market. That market in 2013 was about $6 billion, so it's not a trivial market, and it's growing at a rate of about 27% per annum. So a lot of investment going into this area. There's lots of players, but the bulk of that market is concentrated in around about 10 significant organizations. And those organizations have grown to the point they are and established the business levels they have by establishing a broad portfolio of services across a number of different aspects of drug discovery. And of course, many pharma companies and increasingly biotech companies and academic groups use China-based CROs as strategic partners, both as a way of accessing relatively economic resource, but also as a way of managing the ebb and flow of the requirements of their own internal projects. Our own model is to build an open access capability and technology platform, and we're really all about enabling companies to develop their products. And the scope of our activities is demonstrated by the graphic at the bottom of this page. I'm not going to address all of these areas, there simply isn't time, but of course I'd be happy to talk about it offline. What I'll talk about in a bit more detail is my own interest around building the rare disease platform to support our activities, in particular in China. And the graphic you see on the screen at the moment really describes our thinking around how we should do this, and it's a patient-focused activity. So the first key aspect of this activity is to reach out to patients, to identify patients and support patients, and then through that activity to build our database of genetic information, access to human tissue, and to use that in the development of biomarker and diagnostic tools, and ultimately to enable a faster patient approach. And many of you will have seen our recent acquisition of Nextcode Genetics, which gives us the database and platform to support our own next-generation sequencing tools. But this is only one aspect of a complex drug discovery paradigm. And of course, once we're identifying genes, we can start to build tools for mechanistic understanding. We have the tools to do that. And of course, when we have mechanistic understanding and target validation, we can do target-based drug discovery, which is exactly what we're set up to do. I promised a few examples of collaborations, and the first one here, I think you'll recognize that Elbasvir is certainly not a Rule of 5 compliant molecule. This is a compound that came out of a collaboration we had over a number of years with Merck, and in fact we identified a whole series of HCV compounds, one of which is now approved. They broadly belong to this class of chemistry. They arose from a very intensive medicinal chemistry program that was driven by ourselves in collaboration with Merck in the US. That's a small molecule example, but I have many other examples in other areas of drug discovery. And the example here is a biologic company based in China that works with us to access a worldwide market through the US and with us obtaining regulatory approval for their product. And of course, we're carrying out the manufacturing for this program. And then a well-known joint venture we have with MedImmune to carry out biologics-based drug discovery in China using our platforms. We're a manufacturing company, and you may know of a product called Imbruvica, which is a pharmacyclics product for which we have sole responsibility for manufacturing, and that is a commercial stage asset. And the elevating graphic here shows the increasing number of people that have been treated with this product. I'll close briefly by coming back to the notion of supporting small companies and non-for-profit organizations. And the graphic here demonstrates or just illustrates the changing picture of the client base in my own group in China. And it indicates just over the last year that we've seen about a threefold increase in the number of projects, clients that are non-for-profit organizations, and a slightly smaller increase in the number of biotech clients, a small decrease in the number of pharma clients. I'd add that about 50% of our projects are what I would call small projects or mid-sized projects with less than 10 FTEs. So we're very much an organization focused on supplying services to early-stage projects and small companies. So the scope and depth of our interactions is growing through that focus on early-stage and small projects. And we like to think of ourselves as both a gateway into and also a gateway out of China. So thank you very much for your attention.